Flaxborough, as always, presented its habitual quietness with the studious efficiency of a cat napping in the sun. Early September brought a peculiar air of expectation, as if the town collectively sensed that something, though hardly catastrophic, might unsettle the usual equilibrium. And indeed, on a Tuesday that was neither too warm nor too wet, the Flaxborough annual flower show opened its gates to a modest crowd whose seriousness seemed to depend entirely upon the arrangement of chrysanthemums in perfect tiers. Inspector Purbright arrived just after 10 o'clock, having received a polite summons from the chairwoman of the Horticultural Society, Mrs. Crispin, a woman whose bun was as immovable as her convictions about garden etiquette. He had expected perhaps an incident of a misplaced vase, or a mild argument over judging standards. What he found instead was something curiously less dramatic, yet oddly unsettling. The disturbance was first reported by Mrs. Oliphant, custodian of the rose section, and reputed in town for her sharp eyes and sharper tongue. "It's the strangest thing," she said, adjusting her pince-nez. "I came to inspect the dahlias and found, well, nothing, just a little smile, that's all. A smile, very quiet, just standing there." The object of her discomposure was Sister Agnes, a nun of the local convent, standing incongruously beside the geranium display. She was short, composed, and distinctly unsmiling, at least until now, when she had smiled at precisely midnight, according to Mrs. Oliphant, who insisted upon such details with fervour. Of course, midnight had not yet arrived, but Mrs. Oliphant's tendency for dramatization lent her claim a curious resonance. By the time Purbright had arrived, the sister had quietly returned to her place among the spectators. Yet murmurs had begun to circulate, as they do in Flaxborough, about nuns who smiled at midnight, roses that might wither without supervision, and the general decline of moral standards. The chatter, hushed but enthusiastic, reached even the clerk at the town hall, who had no particular interest in flowers, but took an immediate moral interest in anything involving nuns. Purbright's first observation was of the subtle anxiety in Mrs. Oliphant's posture. It was not terror, merely a deep and particular curiosity, tinged with fear that she might have misjudged something socially important. He made a polite mental note that anyone who feared the judgment of Flaxborough more than crime itself might prove, in due course, a valuable witness. A slight commotion near the refreshments table drew his attention next. Mr. Bartram, the local confectioner and occasional counsellor, had discovered that his prized sugar-glass tulip, intended for the display of edible artistry, had vanished. "Vanished, sir! Stolen!" he declared, with the solemnity of a man reporting a national catastrophe. His daughter, Miss Bartram, hovered nearby, fanning herself, with a pamphlet on begonias, her expression one of mild embarrassment at her father's theatricality. Purbright, taking a small notebook from his coat, jotted down the details in neat, orderly script, noting in particular that no one else appeared to have noticed the disappearance, at least not yet. He understood that in a town such as Flaxborough, even a trivial theft could ripple out into a complex social narrative, with accusations whispered under the guise of floral enthusiasm. "What a peculiar morning," he murmured to himself, a faint smile of his own tugging at the corner of his lips. It was precisely the sort of minor but intricate irregularity that suited his temperament, not violent, not spectacular, merely a gentle fissure in the carefully polished surface of daily life. He lingered for a moment near the dahlias, observing Sister Agnes as she inspected a particularly austere arrangement. Her smile had disappeared. There was nothing remarkable about her now, save perhaps for an almost imperceptible lift of her chin, which in Purbright's experience could signify either amusement or calculation, occasionally both. He pocketed his notebook and moved toward the refreshment stand, where Mrs. Crispin was arranging her biscuits with military precision. "Inspector Purbright," she said with a faint nod, "you have arrived just in time to witness the subtle chaos our town has produced, and do not imagine that it is only the sugar tulip. There is, I assure you, more to come." Purbright inclined his head. "Indeed, Mrs. Crispin, and I shall endeavour to ensure that nothing, however subtle, escapes my attention." Behind them, a small boy dropped his ice cream near the chrysanthemums, eliciting a minor gasp from an elderly spectator. Purbright made a quiet note of the incident as well. In Flaxborough, even an accidental mess could reveal intent, character, and occasionally the oddest of crimes. Thus began the peculiar morning in Flaxborough, with a smiling nun, a missing sugar tulip, and the polite stirrings of curiosity that, as Purbright knew, would eventually lead him into the heart of a mystery far more intricate than anyone had anticipated. By mid-morning, the modest throng at the flower show had begun to swell, carrying with it a rising tide of speculation that seemed almost to hover above the chrysanthemums and dahlias like a summer haze. Flaxborough had a habit of transforming minor occurrences into elaborate narratives, and the missing sugar-glass tulip was quickly assuming mythic proportions. Mrs. Oliphant, who had first alerted the world to Sister Agnes's curious smile, was now circulating among acquaintances, confiding in a tone of quiet urgency that the convent's routines had perhaps been unsettled by something inexplicable. "One does not smile at midnight without reason," she intoned to Mr. Hargreaves, the local bank manager, who nodded gravely, though he had little notion why it should matter. "It is highly irregular," she concluded, as if irregularity itself might topple the social order. Mr. Bartram, on the other hand, pursued his own interpretation of the events with unerring theatricality. He spoke loudly enough to reach anyone who would listen, declaring that his sugar tulip's disappearance was surely a comment on his professional reputation. "Can you imagine," he demanded, gesturing wildly toward the empty pedestal, "what my clients will think? That I cannot safeguard even a confection of this modest scale?" His daughter, Miss Bartram, demurred politely, but her sighs suggested a habitual resignation to her father's dramatic flair. Purbright, moving through the crowd with deliberate slowness, made careful mental notes of each conversation. He paid particular attention to the contrast between what people said and how they said it, understanding that in a town such as Flaxborough, the manner of speech often revealed far more than the words themselves. Mrs. Oliphant's fascination with midnight smiles, for instance, seemed almost as much about asserting her own perceptiveness as about the nun's behaviour. Similarly, Mr. Bartram's dismay appeared equal parts financial and performative, a subtle combination that hinted at vulnerabilities not immediately apparent to casual observers. A small cluster had gathered near the refreshment stand, where Mrs. Crispin was gently chiding a young man for leaning on the table. He was Mr. Allen, a visiting photographer who had been contracted to document the flower show. Purbright noted that Mr. Allen's manner was calm, polite, yet with a hint of impatience, an emotion he hid carefully behind courtesy. "You are certain no one touched the tulip but yourself?" Purbright asked, more as a conversational bridge than a pointed inquiry. Mr. Allen nodded, though the slight hesitation before he did so did not escape Purbright's notice. Meanwhile, the story of Sister Agnes's midnight smile had begun to drift beyond the flower show, carried on whispers in the market square, the post office, and even the railway buffet, where the tea ladies regarded it as a matter of profound curiosity. Some insisted that it could only signify a hidden scandal within the convent. Others, more cautious, speculated that it was merely a private amusement of the nun herself. Purbright allowed the gossip to proceed without interference, aware that the townspeople often supplied more insight than they realized. By late morning, the first subtle tensions began to emerge. Mrs. Oliphant's frequent glances toward the convent stand suggested unease, as if she feared that Sister Agnes might vanish before she had fully observed the repercussions of her smile. Mr. Bartram, meanwhile, continued to hover about the pedestal, eyeing it as though the sugar tulip might reappear of its own accord, and muttering about surveillance and responsibility in tones that drifted uneasily toward accusation. Even the visiting photographer seemed slightly on edge, as though the events of the morning had unsettled the calm order of his professional detachment. Purbright, for his part, maintained a careful balance of engagement and detachment. He observed, questioned gently, and allowed each individual to reveal themselves in small, telling gestures, a tightened jaw, a diverted gaze, a fleeting flush of indignation. Each nuance was catalogued silently in his mind, forming a lattice of potential motives and minor contradictions that he suspected would eventually converge in a way that would surprise no one and yet satisfy the requirements of justice. It was, after all, rarely the large or obvious transgressions that revealed character. Rather, it was in the tiny, almost invisible frictions of daily life that the true nature of Flaxborough's residence showed itself. And already, in the polite chaos of chrysanthemums, sugar tulips and whispered theories, Purbright could sense that this ostensibly trivial morning was laying the groundwork for a mystery of subtler, yet no less intricate, design. Purbright spent the remainder of the morning moving quietly from one participant to another, asking gentle, seemingly incidental questions that he knew often revealed far more than a direct interrogation. Mrs. Oliphant was first, still hovering near the rose display, her hands clasped tightly, as though she feared the act of letting go might cause the mystery itself to evaporate. "Quite an extraordinary morning, Mrs. Oliphant," he began, his tone deliberately neutral, "though I imagine the tulip's disappearance has caused some mild distress." "Oh, Inspector," she replied, a tremor of self-importance in her voice. "Distress is hardly the word. It is positively scandalous. One does not expect theft at a flower show, and yet here we are." And that smile, Sister Agnes, smiling as if she alone knew something secret at midnight. She paused, as if that single fragment of information might suffice to explain everything. Purbright nodded encouragingly, making no attempt to correct the time discrepancy, knowing well that the precise hour was less important than the emphasis it conveyed on her perception of propriety. He moved next to Mr. Bartram, who was inspecting the empty pedestal with a kind of fussy reverence. "Anything unusual at the time of the disappearance, Mr. Bartram?" Purbright asked, casually tilting his head to one side. "Well," said Bartram, adjusting his waistcoat, "I had stepped to the refreshment table to pour a glass of water. The tulip? It was gone when I returned. It could not have been more than a minute or two. Surely someone of opportunity," he faltered, glancing toward a cluster of younger spectators, "could have taken it." His fingers drummed nervously against the table. Purbright made a note of the emphasis on opportunity and the subtle, almost imperceptible narrowing of Bartram's eyes when he glanced at the convent stand. It was not evidence, exactly, but a quiet thread that could later be drawn into the pattern of the morning. He paused briefly near Miss Bartram, who was fussing with a stray leaflet, ostensibly arranging it for aesthetic effect. "I understand you witnessed some of the excitement, Miss Bartram," he said. "Anything of note?" "Oh, Inspector, my father is dramatic," she said, half smiling, half sighing. "He imagines theft at every turn. I think the tulip has simply been misplaced, or perhaps someone borrowed it, innocently. But Mother would be mortified if anyone discovered it missing." She leaned slightly closer, in the manner of one imparting a confidant's insight. "And the nun—well, she does smile sometimes," One mustn't read too much into it. Purbright nodded, tucking the remark away. Even the most innocuous statements could serve as lenses through which the truth became clearer. As the morning wore on, Purbright's observations extended to more casual interactions, the slight tension in the tea lady's hands as they passed cups, the precise way Mr. Hargreaves rearranged his spectacles before answering a question, the subtle glance Sister Agnes cast at Mrs. Oliphant when she lingered too long near the rose display. Each small gesture, each carefully measured word, contributed to the lattice of behaviour that Purbright methodically catalogued in his mind. He made a brief detour to speak with Mr. Allen, the photographer, whose calm exterior had begun to show faint cracks. "Did you notice anything unusual while setting up your shots?" Purbright asked, gesturing lightly to the dais and displays. "Unusual?" Mr. Allen considered, tapping a finger against his chin. "Not exactly. Though the tulip pedestal was empty for a moment before I took the next series of photographs. It struck me as odd, but perhaps I am too accustomed to chaos in the studio." There was a flicker of unease, a hesitation that suggested he had seen something he was reluctant to articulate. Purbright made no immediate comment, allowing the implication to settle quietly in the man's mind. By noon, the flower show had returned, superficially at least, to its ordered routine. Yet the subtle tensions persisted, whispered conjectures, small glances, and the lingering fascination with a smile that no one could quite explain. Purbright observed it all with quiet patience, understanding that the threads of motive and opportunity in Flaxborough were often interwoven with curiosity, pride, and the town's habitual attention to propriety. He concluded his initial inquiries with a careful review of the displays, noting in particular the empty pedestal, the arrangement of flowers nearby, and the peripheral positioning of the convent stand. It was all, he reflected, deceptively ordinary, a small disruption in a town accustomed to routine. And yet, as he walked back toward the refreshment stand, he allowed himself a faint, private smile. He suspected correctly that the modest events of the morning would lead, in time, to revelations far more subtle and intricate than anyone currently imagined. By mid-afternoon, the flower show had settled into the quiet rhythm of polite observation and restrained commentary, but the disappearance of the sugar-glass tulip continued to ripple through Flaxborough with the persistence of an undercurrent. Among the officials and spectators, one name began to emerge more prominently than others. Young Mr. Fletcher, the apprentice at Bartram's confectionery, whose reputation for clumsiness had long been a source of quiet amusement in the town. "Of course it was Fletcher," whispered Mrs. Oliphant to the tea ladies near the refreshment stand, her voice pitched just low enough to ensure that it carried, but avoided, direct accusation. "He's always fiddling where he ought not. A boy who cannot mind his own business is the sort to... well, you understand." Mr. Bartram, when approached about this theory, readily seized upon it with the satisfaction of a man who prefers a tidy explanation. Yes, precisely. Fletcher was likely involved. He has been seen near the pedestal before, and a sugar-glass tulip is the sort of thing a young apprentice might be tempted to examine, but, naturally, I would never presume to accuse him without evidence. His hands, however, betrayed him, twitching slightly as if to demonstrate the act of confiscation he imagined. Purbright listened with his customary courtesy, nodding at intervals and making a discreet note in his mental ledger. He observed Fletcher from across the room, noting the boy's carefully composed posture and the faint, habitual twitch of one eye when attention was directed toward him. The signs were, in Purbright's assessment, perfectly consistent with anxiety, though anxiety of what nature remained to be seen. When he finally approached the boy, Purbright's manner was deliberately light, almost conversational. "Mr. Fletcher," he said, "I hear you were near the tulip pedestal this morning." Quite a busy display, was it not? Fletcher blinked rapidly, nodding. Yes, sir. Very busy. I was just helping, sir. I didn't touch anything. Honest, sir. His hands fidgeted with a stray flower stem, twisting it nervously between thumb and forefinger. Of course, said Purbright, allowing his voice to convey only the faintest suggestion of scrutiny. And yet it appears the tulip has gone missing? Curious, is it not, that it should disappear precisely when attention is elsewhere? Fletcher's glance darted toward the pedestal, then to the floor, and finally back to Purbright. I don't know, sir. Maybe someone else, maybe... He faltered, a nervous laugh escaping him, and Purbright, for the moment, allowed the boy the dignity of his own explanation. The inspector then turned his attention to Mr. Bartram again, noting the small, subtle shift in expression when he mentioned Fletcher's potential involvement. Pride and exasperation intermingled, and yet Purbright sensed beneath it all a quietly held hope that the matter would resolve neatly with a single culprit identified and the town's social order restored. He refrained from pressing the issue further, understanding that a hasty conclusion would have little value. In Flaxborough, it was often the case that the first suspect was merely the most convenient, not the most accurate. Patience, careful observation, and the accrual of minute details would, as always, serve better than direct accusation. As the afternoon waned, Purbright wandered through the remaining exhibits, noting with interest that the positioning of the geraniums and begonias had subtly shifted, as though some hands had attempted to obscure or rearrange the evidence of human movement. The air of ordinary civility remained, yet a quiet tension threaded through the polite smiles and whispered commentary. He allowed himself a faint, private smile of his own. The first suspect was evident, yes, but in Flaxborough the apparent resolution was rarely the true one. By the time the flower show drew to a close, the consensus among townsfolk leaned comfortably toward Fletcher's inadvertent culpability. Purbright, however, was less persuaded. He had learned, over many such mornings and countless small disturbances, that the truth often resided not in the obvious act, but in the subtleties of observation. The hesitation in a glance, the excess of concern, the incongruous timing of a smile. He departed the showground with a notebook lightly filled with preliminary notes, each observation catalogued for later reflection. The apparent neatness of the situation, Fletcher as the first obvious suspect, Sister Agnes as the quietly bemused observer, and Mr. Bartram as the indignant victim, was, in Purbright's estimation, simply the first layer. Beneath it lay something less orderly, yet more revealing of human nature and small-town intricacy. And as he walked toward the station, the subtle thought persisted in his mind that the modest morning's disturbances were merely the prelude to a more intricate pattern, yet to emerge. Purbright spent the early evening retracing the morning's steps, moving quietly through the flower show grounds, now nearly empty, save for a few lingering officials and the last stragglers of spectators. The sugar-glass tulip's absence remained unresolved, and the neat theory of Fletcher's culpability had begun to feel fragile under the inspector's calm scrutiny. It was, as often in Flaxborough, a small and almost trivial observation that caught his attention. A delicate smear of powdered sugar clung to the edge of a nearby bench, faint enough to escape casual notice, yet unmistakable under the careful eye of a man attuned to subtle deviations. Purbright bent slightly, examining it in the waning light. The granules were not the result of clumsiness. They had been brushed aside deliberately, as if to conceal a passage, a path, or an interaction. He noted, too, the orientation of the dais for the flower arrangements. One small vase, ordinarily aligned with the others, had been slightly rotated. A minor social faux pas, easily overlooked, but one that suggested someone had handled the display and then adjusted it hurriedly, almost imperceptibly, to avoid notice. The juxtaposition of these small irregularities, the sugar, the rotated vase, the precise position of the convent stand, began to form a faint but coherent pattern in Purbright's mind. It was the triviality of these clues rather than any dramatic flourish that made them significant. The sugar smear implied human movement, the vase suggested deliberate adjustment. The nun's earlier smile, previously dismissed as inconsequential, now hinted at awareness or participation at a quiet, almost imperceptible level. Purbright allowed the connections to simmer without forcing them, confident that the layering of small details would eventually point to the true narrative. He paused near the edge of the garden, observing the remaining townsfolk as they gathered their belongings. Each carried the residue of the morning's social performance, the faint tension of propriety, the half-concealed satisfaction of gossip, shared, the understated anxiety of those who feared judgment. In Flaxborough, it was rarely the overt act that mattered. The subtlest gestures, the most minute inconsistencies, revealed character more faithfully than any outburst of emotion. As he walked toward the exit, Purbright reflected on the pattern of the morning. Fletcher's nervousness, Mr. Bartram's dramatic indignation, Mrs. Oliphant's insistent theories, and Sister Agnes's enigmatic smile each had a role to play. And yet it was the sugar, the rotated vase, and the faint gestures of concealment that now demanded attention. They suggested intention, albeit discreet, and pointed away from the convenient first suspect towards something slightly more intricate and character-driven. Purbright made a small, careful note in his pocket notebook. Observe interactions near pedestal and convent stand, especially gestures of concealment. Minor irregularities may prove significant. He allowed himself a faint, private smile at the prospect. The puzzle, it seemed, was only beginning to reveal its true shape, and he, as ever, preferred to let the town's own rhythms provide the narrative, gently guiding them toward disclosure through observation rather than accusation. By the time he departed, Flaxborough had resumed its ordinary appearance, but the traces of disturbance lingered invisibly. Powdered sugar in corners, slightly rotated flowers, whispered speculation about midnight smiles. Purbright knew that in due course these subtle indicators would illuminate the truth, but for now he returned to the station with the patience of a man confident that time, detail, and quiet attention would do what accusation alone never could. By the following morning, the modest stir of the flower show had begun to reverberate beyond the confines of the gardens, carried through Flaxborough by polite conjecture and half-formed suspicions. Purbright, ever deliberate in his approach, decided to widen his inquiries, not in haste, but with measured curiosity, allowing the town's social currents to reveal themselves in their own time. He first called on Mrs. Crispin, who had resumed her regular routines of biscuit arrangement and tea service. She spoke with precise authority about minor grievances, the inconvenience of late arrivals, the way some exhibitors handled their blooms with careless fingers, and a whispered rumour concerning Mr. Hargreaves, the bank manager, who had allegedly quibbled over judging criteria. Though apparently trivial, each remark carried subtle indications of rivalry, resentment, or embarrassment, the quiet undercurrents that so often guided human behaviour. From there, Purbright visited the post office, where the postmistress, Mrs. Quimby, mentioned a conversation overheard the day before. "I might be imagining it," she said, leaning on the counter with mild concern, "but I heard Miss Thistleton of the library remarking how she would have preferred to arrange the tulips herself. She has quite an eye, you know, and perhaps a small rivalry with Mr. Bartram." The comment, incidental to most, was filed immediately by Purbright for its potential to indicate minor jealousies and unspoken motives. He also noted the behaviour of the convent. Sister Agnes had returned to her usual quiet routines, yet her subtle attentiveness to visitors, the way she moved among the flower beds, and the occasional faint lift of her eyebrows suggested that she was far from indifferent to the morning's events. Her demeanour was carefully composed, revealing almost nothing, but small deviations, a brush of a glove, a slightly misaligned habit, hinted at awareness of circumstances beyond the obvious. Purbright's investigations then took him to the railway buffet, where a few early commuters discussed the flower show with a gentle exaggeration typical of Flaxborough. Opinions varied. Some blamed Fletcher, some speculated about rival exhibitors, and a few, always the few, hinted at a subtle interference by outsiders. The pattern was consistent, a mix of petty grievance, pride, and habitual attention to propriety. Each person revealed not only what they thought of the tulip, but also what they valued, what they feared, and what they quietly envied. By late afternoon, the cumulative picture had begun to emerge. There were rivalries, yes, minor disputes between exhibitors, subdued irritation among local officials, but there was also a single, pervasive feature of the morning that remained curious. The sugar-glass tulip had vanished, in a manner almost ceremonial, brushed lightly aside, noticed only by the most observant, and, intriguingly, timed with Sister Agnes's smile. The coincidence could not be dismissed as mere happenstance. Purbright allowed himself a moment of reflection. Flaxborough, as he well knew, was rarely stirred by overt criminality. It was the quiet rivalries, the subtle infringements, and the carefully concealed gestures that offered insight into human nature. And in the case of the missing tulip, it seemed increasingly clear that the truth would reside in a nexus of these minor behaviours rather than any single dramatic action. As evening approached, he returned briefly to the flower show grounds, now quiet and nearly deserted. The air was filled with the faint scent of wilting petals, and small traces of powdered sugar, overlooked by most, remained on benches and pathways. Purbright bent to inspect them, his calm mind noting how the minutiae of human activity, the sweep of a hand, the rotation of a vase, the careful avoidance of gaze, had quietly left their mark. Each detail, when later assembled, would guide him toward clarity, provided he waited patiently and allowed the subtle threads to reveal themselves. In expanding the field of observation, Purbright had begun to perceive the layered complexity of a seemingly simple event. There were more town characters involved than he had initially considered, each carrying their own minor grievances, secret pride, or concealed amusement. And in Flaxborough, the quiet accumulation of such small details often proved far more revealing than any overt confession or dramatic spectacle. 2 days after the flower show, Flaxborough experienced a second, subtler disturbance that shifted the tenor of the investigation. Early in the morning, Mrs. Oliphant arrived at the town hall to report a minor but curious misplacement. A set of judging ribbons, awarded the previous year to her prize chrysanthemums, had been moved from their customary display case to a locked cupboard in the back room. The ribbons themselves were undisturbed, clean, untangled, but the act of relocation, accomplished with quiet precision, struck her as an affront to order and taste. Purbright was summoned, and he arrived without haste, noting the subdued anxiety in Mrs. Oliphant's demeanour. "Inspector," she said, with a faint tremor in her voice, "it is not theft, strictly speaking, but the ribbons have been interfered with." "Who would do such a thing, sir?" "That," Purbright replied, allowing a slight smile, "is precisely what we are here to discover. Though it may not be theft, it is still an alteration of the ordinary, which in Flaxborough merits investigation. He inspected the cupboard carefully. The ribbons had been arranged neatly, almost ceremonially, as though the person responsible wished to avoid suspicion while leaving a subtle mark of their presence. As he questioned the hall staff, it became evident that several minor rivalries had threaded through the event unnoticed. Miss Thistleton, librarian and occasional critic of Mrs. Oliphant's horticultural methods, had been unusually attentive to the display last year, though she protested innocence vigorously. Mr. Hargreaves, the bank manager, had commented casually on the placement of the ribbons during last year's awards, though in a joking tone which Purbright filed away as possibly relevant in assessing the town's interpersonal dynamics. Even the seemingly peripheral participants now drew his attention. The visiting photographer, Mr. Allen, had been seen earlier in the week near the town hall, ostensibly delivering photographs, but Purbright noted the slight smudge of powdered sugar on his cuff, faint, almost imperceptible, suggesting a path between the flower show and this later incident. The coincidence could have been trivial, yet in combination with previous observations, the sugar smear, the rotated vase, the subtle movements of Sister Agnes, it formed a faint pattern of deliberate yet understated actions. Purbright also observed the reactions of others. Mrs. Crispin, ever precise in her duties, had been slightly flustered by the relocation, her hands momentarily trembling as she adjusted the ribbons. Mr. Bartram, informed of the event, expressed irritation that bordered on indignation, though he directed his comments toward the librarians and staff rather than the convent. Each response, small as it seemed, contributed to the emerging tableau of minor intrigues and concealed motivations. By afternoon, it was clear that the second incident had disrupted the neat narrative that had initially implicated Fletcher. The ribbons had been handled with care, and no direct evidence pointed to him. Indeed, his nervousness at the flower show now seemed less incriminating in light of this new, precise interference, suggesting that the events of the previous morning were part of a more complex, understated orchestration. Purbright allowed the town to speculate freely, observing their interactions and noting who seemed eager to assign blame and who remained quietly detached. In Flaxborough, he knew, the subtle hierarchies of propriety and reputation were often as informative as overt actions. He made a private note of Sister Agnes's presence near the ribbons earlier that morning, recalling her faint smile at the flower show, the deliberate air of composure she maintained, and the almost imperceptible ways she positioned herself in social spaces. The second incident, modest though it was, had altered the field. What had begun as a simple case of a missing sugar-glass tulip now revealed layers of intention and subtle social navigation. Purbright understood that patience, careful attention to the seemingly trivial, and an understanding of Flaxborough's quiet hierarchies would be essential in unravelling the truth. By evening, he returned to his office, notebook in hand, cataloguing observations and small irregularities, aware that the investigation had moved beyond the obvious, and that each minor gesture, each understated smile or carefully placed object would need to be integrated into the growing pattern before any conclusion could be drawn. Purbright spent the late evening alone in his office, the gentle tapping of rain against the windows providing a steady, unobtrusive background to his reflections. The events of the past days, what outwardly appeared to be trivial disruptions in Flaxborough, had begun to accumulate into a pattern that, while subtle, was unmistakably coherent in its own understated way. He considered the townspeople individually, cataloguing not only their actions, but the nuances of their behaviour. Mrs. Oliphant, whose keen eye had first noticed the nun's smile, was motivated as much by pride in her perceptiveness as by curiosity. Mr. Bartram, indignant over his missing tulip, was less concerned with the object itself than with his standing in the social hierarchy of Flaxborough. The dramatic gestures and performative anxiety were almost a ritual of self-affirmation. Fletcher, nervous and awkward, seemed largely a convenient repository for others' suspicions, a boy whose genuine concern had been magnified into apparent culpability. And then there was Sister Agnes. Her early morning smile, so quietly observed, and her meticulous comportment throughout the events of the flower show suggested someone acutely aware of how small gestures could ripple through a community. Purbright considered the timing of her smile and the coinciding disappearance of the sugar-glass tulip, the faint traces of powdered sugar and subtle adjustments to the displays, and the way she positioned herself near key areas without drawing attention. Nothing in her behavior suggested overt malice. Rather, it indicated careful orchestration, deliberate and almost playful in its subtlety. Flaxborough itself, he reflected, provided a perfect backdrop for such subtleties. Its citizens were trained in the arts of propriety, discretion, and quiet observation. Minor rivalries, petty embarrassments, and understated social performances often mattered more than the events themselves. A theft, a smile, a displaced ribbon, each was amplified by the network of perceptions and judgments that wove through the town like invisible threads. Purbright allowed himself a small smile. In many ways, the case resembled a delicate dance in which each participant contributed movements of intention or curiosity, yet remained entirely unaware of the overarching pattern. The challenge was not to uncover a single dramatic act, but to perceive the choreography behind it, the interplay of observation, misdirection, pride, and subtle intervention. He reviewed his notes methodically. The sugar-glass tulip, removed briefly, unnoticed by most, except for those observant enough to note its absence. The judging ribbons, relocated neatly, without damage, signaling a minor assertion of influence rather than chaos. The subtle gestures, the rotated vase, the faint lift of eyebrows, the careful positioning of hands, all pointed towards someone who understood both human behavior and the town's particular codes of civility. Purbright concluded that the truth would not be discovered through pressure, accusation, or hasty inference. It would reveal itself in time through carefully staged observation and the gentle probing of social interactions. He needed only to allow the pattern to unfold, confident that the person responsible, someone attentive to both objects and social effect, would eventually betray themselves, even if subtly, by action or word. In the quiet of his office, surrounded by orderly papers and the soft hum of the gaslight, Purbright felt the familiar satisfaction of a case taking shape. Flaxborough had presented its puzzle in miniature, understated, socially intricate, and, like all true puzzles of human behavior, waiting for patient attention to illuminate the truth. He closed his notebook with a soft click, leaning back in his chair, content to let the town's own rhythms provide the next revelation. Purbright chose a quiet Wednesday morning to set his subtle test in motion. The flower show had long concluded, yet traces of its minor disturbances still lingered in the town's collective consciousness. He arranged to meet Sister Agnes under the pretense of a polite inquiry into the convent's gardening efforts, ensuring the meeting would appear entirely ordinary to onlookers. The sister received him in the convent garden, her composure flawless as always, her hands lightly tending the roses. Purbright greeted her with gentle civility, commenting on the weather and the precise alignment of the flower beds, all while observing her every reaction with careful attention. "I understand, Sister Agnes," he said casually, "that the flower show caused a certain amount of speculation. One might even say curiosity ran rather high among the attendees." He allowed his tone to linger just long enough to suggest awareness of details she might prefer left unnoticed. Sister Agnes's hands paused momentarily over a rose, though her face remained calm. "Curiosity," she said, almost with a smile, "is a trait of which the world cannot entirely rid itself. I trust, Inspector, that you find such attention harmless?" Purbright inclined his head. "Harmless, perhaps, but occasionally revealing." He allowed a deliberate pause, noting the slight tightening of her lips, the almost imperceptible lift of an eyebrow, and the careful placement of her hands. Small, controlled movements, yet they spoke volumes to an observer attuned to nuance. "I have always admired the way the townspeople observe detail," she said, lightly brushing a fallen petal from a bench. "It is instructive, is it not?" "Very much so," Purbright replied, maintaining a neutral tone, though internally he catalogued every gesture. And sometimes the keenest observation uncovers matters otherwise unnoticed. Objects misplaced, displays adjusted, subtle signs that might indicate attention to order, or perhaps something slightly more intentional. Her eyes, dark and steady, met his, and for a fraction of a second a trace of something, acknowledgement, amusement, or mild anxiety, flickered before she replaced it with serene composure. Purbright allowed the silence to extend just long enough to suggest that the burden of disclosure might lie with her. They moved slowly among the flower beds, and as they passed the spot where the sugar-glass tulip had stood, Purbright remarked lightly on the precision with which the pedestal had been maintained. "It is a curious thing," he said, "how even the smallest adjustments do not escape notice, especially by those attuned to detail." Sister Agnes responded with gentle civility, yet there was a fleeting hesitation, a micro-gesture, a subtle glance downward, a minuscule shift of weight that would not have gone unnoticed by anyone but Purbright. The test was complete. She had revealed, in the most careful way, that she was fully aware of the disruptions and had participated in their understated orchestration. Purbright thanked her for her time and departed quietly, allowing the scene to remain entirely ordinary to the casual observer. Yet as he walked back toward the station, he knew the puzzle's final piece had been identified. The modest irregularities, the sugar, the rotated vase, the misplaced ribbons, and the subtly staged smile now coalesced into a coherent explanation, waiting only for the final revelation to be delivered with his characteristic calmness and civility. Purbright called a quiet gathering in the reading room of the town hall, inviting only Mrs. Crispin, Mr. Bartram, Fletcher, and Sister Agnes. The room was modest, the afternoon sun filtering through curtained windows, lending a soft, even light to the carefully arranged chairs and tables. The participants, aware of his reputation for subtlety, waited with polite attentiveness, each wondering what manner of conclusion might emerge. "Thank you all for coming," Purbright began, his tone gentle yet precise. "The events of the past week, the disappearance of the sugar-glass tulip, the misplacement of judging ribbons, and the subtle disturbances in the flower show have caused understandable speculation. It is my role to clarify with calm observation and attention to detail what has occurred." He began with the sugar-glass tulip, noting the initial assumption that young Fletcher's nervousness implicated him. "Mr. Fletcher was observed near the pedestal," Purbright said, "and naturally such a detail drew suspicion. Yet careful observation and the timing of events suggest that the tulip's brief absence was not a matter of clumsiness or mischief, but part of a more deliberative, understated orchestration." He moved to the ribbons, describing their precise relocation and the absence of damage, and then to the minor adjustments in flower arrangements, the faint traces of powdered sugar, and the subtle positioning of Sister Agnes at critical moments. Each detail was connected quietly, the links invisible to anyone but a patient and attentive observer. All these incidents, Purbright continued, point to someone who understood both objects and the town's social fabric. Someone capable of small, deliberate gestures without attracting attention. His gaze rested lightly on Sister Agnes, who maintained perfect composure, though a slight lift of her chin betrayed a hint of acknowledgement. "It was," he said, "you, Sister Agnes. Your smile at the flower show was neither random nor trivial. It coincided with the removal of the sugar-glass tulip, and your careful positioning near key displays ensured that the disturbances passed unnoticed by all but the most observant. The ribbons, the rotated vase, even the faint traces of powdered sugar, all were part of a subtle demonstration, a gentle test of attention, perception, and the manner in which our town observes and judges its own minutiae." A quiet hush fell over the room. Mr. Bartram blinked in astonishment. Fletcher fidgeted, and Mrs. Crispin's eyebrows rose ever so slightly. Sister Agnes, serene as ever, inclined her head. "You see clearly, Inspector?" she said softly. "Indeed, I wished only to remind our town that small gestures, unnoticed by many, carry weight in the patterns we follow every day." Purbright allowed a moment of reflection, then concluded, "No harm was intended, no rules truly broken. Yet the exercise has revealed much about attention, propriety, and the quiet observances that define Flaxborough. It is, I believe, a lesson in subtlety for all present." He rose, offering a polite nod to each participant. The room remained calm, the minor astonishment giving way to subdued amusement and reflection. Flaxborough, as ever, resumed its ordered rhythms, the townspeople quietly absorbing the lesson in attentiveness and human behaviour, while the modest disruptions faded into memory. In the days that followed, Flaxborough resumed its familiar rhythm, though with a subtle undercurrent of awareness that had not existed before. The flower show was long over, the sugar-glass tulip returned to its original pedestal, and the judging ribbons carefully restored to their display case, yet the townspeople moved with a slight attentiveness, an almost imperceptible curiosity about what they might overlook. Mrs. Oliphant continued her rounds, noting blooms and exchanges with an air of heightened observation, though she never again mentioned Sister Agnes's midnight smile aloud. Mr. Bartram maintained his usual dramatic expressions, yet there was a restrained quality to his indignation, as if he now measured his gestures against the lesson of subtlety imparted by the recent events. Fletcher, relieved of suspicion, gained a quiet confidence, careful, but no longer burdened by the weight of imagined blame. Even Mr. Allen, the visiting photographer, lingered for a final series of shots, capturing flowers, pedestals, and the delicate geometry of small gestures, all with an unspoken acknowledgement of their significance. The convent itself resumed its orderly routines. Sister Agnes continued to smile at moments no one else noticed, tending the gardens with the same precision and serenity, leaving her fellow townspeople to ponder, at a remove, the quiet impact of those smiles. There was no disruption, no accusation, merely the gentle hum of a town that had learned to observe a little more carefully, and perhaps to judge a little less hastily. Purbright returned to his office, settling into his habitual paperwork with the calm satisfaction of a man who had observed and waited. His notes, now complete, reflected a tableau of human behaviour, minor rivalries, understated gestures, polite deceptions, and careful attention, all converging in the deliberate orchestration of one quiet figure. The solution had required no confrontation, no drama, only patience, discernment, and the subtle art of noticing what most overlooked. As he filed the final sheets, he allowed himself a moment to reflect on Flaxborough itself, a town of polite facades, modest rivalries, and carefully maintained appearances, yet full of insight for those willing to see beyond the ordinary. The mystery of the missing sugar-glass tulip and the relocated ribbons was resolved not with spectacle, but with quiet clarity. The town had endured its small perturbation, learned its gentle lesson, and settled back into its unassuming routine, enriched, if quietly, by the experience. Purbright leaned back in his chair, the faint smile of satisfaction playing across his face, knowing that the order of Flaxborough, subtle though it might be, remained intact, and that human nature, observed patiently, continued to reveal its secrets in the most unobtrusive of ways.